My name is Scarlett Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I was the youngest senior operations director at a mid-sized corporate consulting firm in Chicago. People usually describe me the same way: calm, reliable, low maintenance. The kind of woman who doesn't need to be managed. The kind who fixes problems quietly and doesn't require applause. I've been called composed, efficient, even safe. Safe is an interesting word. It means you're trusted with responsibility. It also means you're trusted to absorb damage. For most of my career, I was the steady one in the room. While others debated loudly, I listened. While others positioned themselves visibly, I worked behind the scenes. I understood financial reports, compliance structures, risk exposure, details most executives skimmed past. I didn't need attention. I believed competence would speak for itself. And in many ways it did. Until the day I realized my promotion was never a reward. It was insulation. The title came with authority in name, liability in reality. I want to tell this story carefully. Not as revenge, not as drama, not as a story about destroying someone who underestimated me. This is about recognition, about the quiet moment when you understand that what looks like success might actually be a shield placed between other people and consequences, about how silence can be weakness or strategy, and how dignity doesn't require noise. If you've ever been the dependable one, if you've ever been handed more responsibility without more protection, if you've ever sensed something was off but couldn't yet prove it, you might understand the kind of awakening I'm about to describe. This isn't a story about burning bridges. It's a story about stepping aside and letting structures collapse under their own weight. I won't exaggerate, I won't dramatize, and I won't pretend I was fearless. There were nights I questioned myself. There were meetings where I felt the shift before I had language for it. And there was one specific day, the day I read a document I was never meant to read, that everything aligned. But before that moment, you need to understand who I was to them. Because the most dangerous position in any organization isn't the loudest one. It's the quiet one that sees everything. Have you ever realized too late that something you celebrated was designed to protect someone else instead of you? To them, I was the solution, not the visionary, not the face of the company, not the charismatic rainmaker clients remembered after quarterly dinners. I was the stabilizer. If a project fell behind schedule, it quietly landed on my desk. If a client raised compliance concerns, I was looped into the thread. If internal departments clashed over budget allocations, someone would say, "Let Scarlett take a look." It was never framed as a burden. It was framed as trust. She'll handle it. She doesn't get emotional. She understands the details. And I did. I understood how contractual language could shift liability subtly from one department to another. I understood how forecasting models could be presented optimistically without technically being inaccurate. I understood that the difference between negligence and oversight often came down to who signed last. But understanding something and being seen for understanding it are two very different experiences. In executive meetings, I was often the only woman at the table, not because the company lacked talented women, but because the upper tier had quietly filtered into a very specific demographic over the years. I didn't resent it. I had grown used to navigating rooms where my tone had to be measured twice. When I spoke, I chose precision over volume. The louder executives were described as decisive. I was described as thorough. They meant it as a compliment. But thorough people don't threaten power structures. They support them. I noticed early on that when projects succeeded, credit flowed upward. When projects struggled, responsibility flowed sideways, toward operations, toward compliance, toward me. Not aggressively, not maliciously, just naturally. I became the person who absorbed complexity, and because I rarely pushed back publicly, the pattern solidified. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel like exclusion. It feels like inclusion with conditions. You're in the room, you're respected, but you are respected for maintaining stability, not for disrupting narratives. I never threw anyone under the bus. I never leaked frustrations. I never corrected someone mid-presentation, even when I knew the numbers they were quoting had been adjusted for optics. Instead, I would send a follow-up memo, clarify language, adjust exposure quietly. It built my reputation. Scarlett is dependable. Scarlett is calm under pressure. Scarlett doesn't make things political. And perhaps the most defining one, Scarlett doesn't complain. What they didn't understand was that silence is not the same as naivety. I saw how decisions were sequenced. I saw how documentation moved. I saw which executives insisted on written approvals and which preferred verbal agreements that left less trace. I also saw something else. The more indispensable I became operationally, the less visible I became strategically. I was rarely included in early-stage planning conversations. I was brought in when execution began, when risk needed to be managed, which meant I often inherited frameworks I hadn't helped design, frameworks with cracks. At the time, I believed this was simply hierarchy. That influence would come with time. After all, I had just been promoted. Senior Operations Director. The title sounded solid, impressive, earned. My parents framed the announcement email. My colleagues congratulated me warmly. The CEO said in front of the team, "No one deserves this more." I smiled, I thanked them, I went back to work. I didn't yet understand that being the most reliable person in the room sometimes means you're also the most convenient place to redirect impact. To them, I was stability. I just hadn't realized stability could be used as a shield. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen in a boardroom. No one raised their voice. There was no public embarrassment. It was a sentence, a small one. It came 3 weeks after my promotion. We were reviewing a new client acquisition, mid-size manufacturing firm, aggressive expansion strategy, thin compliance documentation. The projections were ambitious, almost too ambitious. I had spent 2 evenings reviewing their submitted financials, noticing inconsistencies in supplier contracts and risk disclosures. In the executive meeting, I spoke carefully. "I think we should delay final approval until we clarify the indemnity clauses," I said. "There's exposure in Section 4.2 that could shift liability back to us if the expansion timeline slips." Silence, a few nods, nothing hostile. Then Daniel, our Chief Growth Officer, leaned back in his chair and smiled lightly. "That's why we promoted you," he said. "You'll make sure operations handles those details." The room chuckled. It wasn't cruel laughter. It wasn't even dismissive on the surface. But something inside me tightened, because what I had suggested was a strategic pause. What he translated it into was operational cleanup. The distinction mattered. I tried once more. It's not just documentation. The structure of the agreement assumes milestones that may not be realistic. Daniel waved a hand gently. "Scarlett, I trust you. If there's risk, you'll mitigate it. That's what you do." And just like that, the responsibility subtly shifted. Not "let's reconsider the deal," not "let's renegotiate terms." Instead, "if something goes wrong, Scarlett will manage it." The meeting moved on. No one objected. No one supported me either. And I did what I always did. I took notes in my black leather notebook and told myself it was fine, that this was normal executive shorthand, that not every concern needed to be escalated. But that evening, at home, I replayed the exchange in my mind. It wasn't what he said. It was how quickly the room accepted the reframing. My role had just been defined for me, not as a decision maker, as a risk absorber. I rationalized it. "You're new to the title. They're adjusting. Trust takes time." And technically, nothing unethical had happened. The contract wasn't fraudulent. The projections weren't fabricated. They were optimistic. Optimism in corporate language is elastic. Over the next few days, I requested additional documentation from the client. I drafted contingency clauses. I built protective language into our internal workflow. No one thanked me. No one needed to. Because in their minds, I was doing exactly what I had been elevated to do. Handle it. A week later, during a casual hallway conversation, I overheard Daniel speaking to the CEO. "Operations signed off," he said. Signed off. I hadn't signed off. I had mitigated exposure. But language is powerful. And in corporate environments, perception often outweighs nuance. I stood still for a moment longer than necessary, just out of sight. That was the first small cut. Not visible, not bleeding, but precise. It taught me something subtle. When people frame your caution as compliance, when they translate your strategic objection into technical support, they are quietly relocating accountability. At the time, I didn't confront it. I adjusted. Because I still believed loyalty and diligence would eventually correct the imbalance. I didn't yet realize that patterns form fastest when no one interrupts them. The second time it happened, I didn't even flinch. That's how I knew something had shifted. Another client, different industry, similar urgency. This time it was an internal restructuring proposal. Cost reductions disguised as strategic realignment. I had reviewed the plan late at night, red flagging unrealistic savings assumptions and underreported severance liabilities. When I presented my findings, I did it the same way I always did: measured, data backed, calm. There's a 3-quarter lag in projected savings, I explained. If we communicate immediate impact to the board, we'll be overstating near-term performance. Daniel nodded as if I had confirmed his point. Right, he said. So operations will adjust implementation to hit those numbers. Again, the reframing. Not the projections are flawed, but operations will make them work. The CEO looked at me. Scarlett, can you tighten execution timelines? There it was. I could have said no. I could have pushed harder, insisted that the board presentation be revised. Instead, I paused for half a second and said, we'll review the rollout sequencing, which was not an agreement, but it wasn't resistance either. After the meeting, one of the junior managers stopped me in the hallway. You always make it look easy, she said. They throw impossible things at you and you just handle it. I smiled. It wasn't easy, but I had trained myself not to show friction. Over time, something subtle began to happen. I started preparing mitigation plans before meetings even started. I anticipated where optimism would overreach. I drafted protective clauses in advance. I created fallback timelines before ambitious ones were approved. It made me efficient. It also made their risk-taking easier, because unconsciously they knew there was a safety net, and I was the net. Disrespect doesn't always look like interruption or raised voices. Sometimes it looks like an assumption. The assumption that you will adapt, that you will clean up, that you will absorb impact quietly because you always have. The language shifted in small ways. Scarlett will handle the compliance side. Scarlett's team will absorb the operational variance. Scarlett's department can buffer the shortfall. Buffer, as if my team, and by extension I, were padding. At first, I told myself this was leadership. Leaders protect the organization. Leaders take pressure off others. But protection without authority is exposure. I began noticing something else. When successes were presented to the board, slides highlighted growth strategy, market capture, and expansion velocity. Operations appeared as a footnote: seamless execution. Seamless, as if complexity resolved itself. During one quarterly dinner, a board member clinked his glass and said to Daniel, "You've built a fearless team." Daniel laughed. It helps to have steady operators backing bold moves. He didn't look at me when he said it, and I didn't expect him to. Because by then, the role had solidified. I was the steady operator, the one who didn't disrupt the narrative, the one who didn't require the spotlight, the one who wouldn't embarrass anyone publicly. I had normalized it. Every time I stayed quiet in a meeting to pick my battles, I reinforced their comfort. Every time I translated unrealistic targets into manageable workflows, I confirmed their assumptions. Every time I corrected numbers privately instead of publicly, I protected reputations. Just not my own. And here's the part I'm not proud of. Part of me liked being indispensable. There is a certain power in knowing that if you stepped away, things would wobble. But indispensability can become a trap when it's built on absorbing other people's overreach. I wasn't being shouted down. I wasn't being excluded. I was being relied on, in a way that slowly shifted risk downward. By the time I recognized the pattern clearly, it no longer felt like a series of isolated moments. It felt structural, and structures are harder to confront than people. There's a moment in every organization when you realize your job description isn't written on paper. It's written in behavior. By the time the third major initiative landed on my desk with pre-approved timelines and optimistic press language already drafted, I stopped pretending it was accidental. I had been assigned a role. Not formally, not maliciously, but clearly. Reliable, capable, invisible. It happened during a strategic off-site retreat in early spring. We were at a glass-walled conference center overlooking Lake Michigan. The setting was polished, almost theatrical. Vision boards, growth forecasts, motivational taglines about bold execution. I was seated halfway down the table. Not at the head, not at the far end. In the middle. A perfect position for someone meant to connect ideas, but not define them. The CEO was presenting an aggressive expansion plan. 2 acquisitions in under 12 months. I had reviewed the preliminary documents the night before. The target companies carried unresolved compliance disputes. Nothing catastrophic, but unresolved. When the CEO finished, he turned to Daniel. "Can growth support this pace?" Daniel nodded confidently. "Absolutely." Then he looked at me. "Operations can stabilize integration, right?" Not "what do you think?" Not "is this feasible?" Just confirmation. A role already assumed. In that split second, I saw the architecture clearly. They designed ambition. I engineered containment. If integration went smoothly, growth would be celebrated. If integration faltered, operations would be scrutinized. Not intentionally, just logically. Because operations touch the mechanics. And mechanics are measurable. I could feel every eye shift subtly toward me. Not challengingly, but expectantly. I answered the way I always had. We'll need phased oversight and expanded compliance review. The CEO smiled. That's why you're here. There it was again. Not a partnership. Function. After the session, as everyone mingled over catered coffee, I stood near the windows and watched the water. One of the senior board advisors approached me quietly. "You're steady," he said. "That's rare." "Thank you," I replied. He studied me for a moment. "Just make sure steady doesn't become silent." It was the first time someone had hinted at the imbalance out loud. But even then I interpreted it as encouragement, not warning. Later that afternoon, I received an updated organizational chart via email. My department had expanded. More teams reporting to me, more cross-functional oversight, more sign-off authority. It looked like growth. But when I examined the reporting structure more closely, I noticed something subtle. Several high-risk integration checkpoints were now formally routed through my approval pipeline, meaning if projections failed, if timelines slipped, if compliance disputes resurfaced, the documentation trail would show my department's signature last. I wasn't just stabilizing operations anymore. I was becoming the final layer before exposure. The title had come with authority in name, liability in reality, and the role assigned to me wasn't accidental. It was structurally convenient. I had built a reputation for absorbing pressure gracefully. Now the system was calibrating around that assumption. The unsettling part wasn't anger. It was clarity. Because once you understand the role others expect you to play, you face a choice. Perform it perfectly, or redefine it quietly. At that point, I hadn't chosen yet. But something inside me had begun to detach. Not emotionally. Strategically. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It happened on a Tuesday evening, long after most of the office lights had gone dark. I was alone in my office reviewing integration documents for one of the acquisitions approved at the retreat. The target company had previously settled a minor regulatory inquiry, nothing that had made headlines, but enough to require careful disclosure language. I wasn't looking for a problem. I was confirming sequencing. There's a specific rhythm to reviewing documents when you've done it long enough. You don't read line by line. You scan for patterns. You notice inconsistencies in phrasing, timestamps that don't align, and clauses that appear slightly revised from earlier drafts. That's when I saw it. A version history note is embedded in the contract metadata. Revised per executive direction. Risk acknowledgement language moved to Appendix C. Appendix C, which in most board presentations never gets displayed. I opened the previous draft from the archive. The earlier version had positioned the regulatory inquiry prominently within Section 2, directly under material considerations. Clear, transparent, uncomfortable. The new version had relocated that language into supplemental documentation. Technically disclosed, practically minimized. I leaned back in my chair. It wasn't illegal, it wasn't fraudulent, the disclosure still existed. But its visibility had been strategically reduced. And here's what shifted. The final approval signature for that revised draft was routed to my office. Not Daniel's, not the CEO's. Mine, meaning if the board later questioned disclosure transparency, the record would show that operations had reviewed and approved the structure. My name. For the first time, I didn't feel irritation. I felt alignment, not emotional alignment, structural alignment. Every small reframing, every subtle redirect, every Scarlett will handle it. They weren't asking me to protect the company. They were positioning me to absorb future scrutiny. The realization wasn't explosive. It was quiet, almost clinical. I opened my black leather notebook and wrote a single sentence. Authority without authorship is exposure. Then I did something I had never done before. I stopped correcting the document. Instead of immediately drafting mitigation language or quietly reformatting the disclosure for better balance, I archived both versions, side by side, time-stamped, documented, not as evidence for revenge, but as clarity for myself. Because something inside me finally understood. I had mistaken responsibility for power. Responsibility is being tasked with outcomes. Power is being included in decisions before outcomes are shaped. I had been living in the first category, believing I occupied the second. That night, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send emails. I didn't escalate. I simply closed my laptop, turned off the lights, and walked out of the building with a steadiness that felt different from before. Not heavier, sharper. On the drive home, I thought about the board advisor's comment. Make sure steady doesn't become silent. He was wrong about one thing. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's recalibration. That was the day something shifted, not externally. Internally, I stopped trying to prove I was indispensable and started asking a different question. If I stepped back strategically, what would happen? After that Tuesday, I didn't change my tone. I changed my timing. There's a difference. Before, when I noticed structural risk, I would intervene early. I would reshape language, adjust projections, and build contingency plans before anyone asked. I thought I was being proactive. Now I began to observe. Not passively, deliberately. In meetings, I still took notes. I still asked clarifying questions. But I stopped filling in gaps that hadn't yet been acknowledged. I allowed optimism to sit in the room without immediately cushioning it. The first time I did this, it felt almost unnatural. We were reviewing integration progress for the acquisition with the relocated disclosure language. The CEO was presenting a clean, confident summary to the executive team. "Early indicators are strong," he said. "No major regulatory friction." There was a slight exaggeration in that phrasing. No major friction was technically accurate, but it glossed over pending compliance reviews still in process. Old Scarlett would have clarified gently. Something like, "We're monitoring a few open inquiries, but they're within manageable thresholds." New Scarlett stayed quiet, not because I wanted anyone to be misled, but because the phrasing reflected authorship. They had shaped the narrative. They owned it. When the CEO glanced at me for confirmation, I gave a small nod. Not endorsement, not correct. Just acknowledgement. The meeting moved forward. Later, Daniel stopped by my office. "You've been quieter lately," he said casually. "I'm prioritizing execution," I replied. He smiled, interpreting it as focus. "Good. We need stability right now." Stability. It's fascinating how quickly silence gets interpreted as compliance. Inside, though, my silence was not surrender. It was data collection. I began organizing documentation more meticulously than ever before. Not altering, not manipulating, simply preserving context. Version histories, email threads, timeline shifts. Who proposed what? Who approved what? When language changed. I stopped offering strategic alternatives unless directly requested. When asked for sign-off, I requested written clarifications on the scope. Calmly, professionally. "Just to confirm," I would write, "this disclosure structure aligns with executive intent?" The replies were always confident. "Yes, aligned. Proceed as discussed." "Approved." Authority in writing. I wasn't building a case. I was restoring symmetry. If I were to carry responsibility, authorship needed to be visible. Over time, something subtle happened. Without my anticipatory corrections, small cracks began surfacing earlier. Timelines slipped by a week instead of being pre-adjusted quietly. Budget variances appeared in raw form before I massaged them into coherence. Nothing catastrophic, just unbuffered reality. And each time, the instinctive reflex of the room was to look toward operations, toward me. But now, when the question came, "Can we smooth this?" I responded differently. "We can execute within the parameters approved." Parameters approved. Language matters. I wasn't obstructing, I wasn't exposing. I was aligning. My silence had become intentional, strategic, structured. They mistook it for steadiness. They thought I had settled more comfortably into my role. In truth, I had stepped slightly outside of it. Because once you understand that you are being positioned as insulation, the most powerful move isn't confrontation. It's removing unnecessary padding and watching what the structure does on its own. If you had walked past my office during those months, nothing would have looked different. My door was still half open. My calendar was still full. My tone was still measured. But beneath the surface, I was preparing, not to attack, to understand. There's a quiet advantage in being underestimated strategically. When people believe you are focused solely on execution, they stop monitoring how deeply you see the blueprint. I began mapping decision flows, not an accusation, in architecture. Every major initiative passed through predictable stages. Ideation between the CEO and Daniel, informal vetting among senior growth leads, presentation to the executive table, formal routing to operations for execution structure, then documentation archived for board visibility. On paper, it looked collaborative. In sequence, it revealed authorship, growth designed velocity, operations absorbed variance. I created a separate private framework, not on company systems, but in my own structured notes. Column 1, proposal origin. Column 2, language adjustments pre-board. Column 3, final sign-off authority. Column 4, operational exposure if projections failed. The pattern was consistent. visibility upward, liability sideways. And because I had spent years being the steady one, no one questioned why I requested clearer documentation. They interpreted it as diligence, which it was, but it was also protection. I enrolled in an advanced corporate governance certification program under the pretense of professional development. The company reimbursed it enthusiastically. After all, having a compliance-savvy operations director strengthened optics. What they didn't notice was how much the coursework deepened my understanding of fiduciary duty structures and director liability frameworks. Specifically, how responsibility is assigned when disclosure is technically accurate, but contextually minimized. Appendix C. That single shift in language had been a lesson. I also began strengthening relationships outside the immediate executive circle. Not gossip, not alliances. Context. I scheduled quiet check-ins with the legal department, not to complain, but to ask procedural questions. How are material disclosures typically framed for board review? I would ask casually. Their answers were neutral, informational. But over time, I understood something important. Legal language often defers to executive framing unless explicitly challenged, meaning if no one contests the presentation structure, the default assumption is consensus. Consensus requires voice, and I had been lending mine silently for years. Another layer they never noticed. I stopped rescuing timelines preemptively. When growth teams projected aggressive integration milestones, I allowed those timelines to enter documentation as written, so long as the approval chain was explicit. Previously, I would adjust internal sequencing quietly to prevent friction. Now I requested written confirmation before modifying anything. Please confirm the milestone prioritization as presented. Always polite, always calm, and always answered. Because confidence is easy when you believe someone else will handle consequences. One evening, as I reviewed a cross-department budget forecast, I noticed something subtle. Marketing spend for one acquisition had been front-loaded heavily to generate strong first-quarter optics. Operational integration costs, however, were deferred into the second quarter, where margin compression would likely occur. That compression would fall under my performance metrics. Previously, I would have smoothed the allocation quietly. Instead, I documented the structure and asked a simple clarification email, just confirming that operational variance in Q2 is aligned with growth acceleration strategy. The response came quickly. Yes, aligned. Alignment. It's remarkable how often people confirm things in writing when they believe the system is stable. What they never noticed was that I was no longer acting as insulation. I was acting as recorder. Not maliciously, not dramatically, but precisely. And internally, something else changed. The anxiety I used to feel before executive meetings, wondering what unrealistic projection I'd need to reinterpret, began fading. Clarity replaces anxiety. Because once you understand the structure, you stop personalizing it. This wasn't about them underestimating me emotionally. It was about them miscalculating my threshold. They believed I would always protect the narrative. They never considered that I might protect the architecture instead. There's a difference. Narratives shift, architecture holds. And architecture, when left unsupported by hidden padding, reveals its true weight. The reveal didn't come with a raised voice or a dramatic discovery. It came through a spreadsheet. Specifically, a consolidated risk exposure report I had quietly rebuilt from archived quarterly data. I wasn't looking for a scandal. I was testing a hypothesis. For months, I had been documenting alignment confirmations, every approved as presented, every aligned with executive intent. I had preserved timeline shifts, disclosure placements, and milestone accelerations. Individually, they were ordinary. Collectively, they formed something else. Pattern density. One Friday afternoon, after most of the office had left early for a long weekend, I stayed behind and pulled historical integration performance against projected executive summaries, column by column. What I discovered wasn't fraud. It was asymmetry. In every acquisition over the past 2 years, growth metrics were evaluated against announced projections. Operations, however, was evaluated against adjusted internal timelines. Timelines that had often been compressed after board presentations, which meant something subtle but significant. When growth overpromised publicly, operations absorbed the gap privately. Performance bonuses for growth leadership were tied to announcement metrics. Operational performance reviews, including mine, were tied to execution variances. Different measurement systems, same project. I stared at the screen for a long time, because the leverage wasn't explosive. It was structural. If I continued smoothing execution without recalibrating measurement frameworks, I would eventually carry documented underperformance for variances I hadn't authored. And then I noticed something even quieter. In the event of regulatory scrutiny over disclosure visibility, operational sign-off appeared as the final checkpoint, meaning narrative framing above me, liability beneath, not malicious, but engineered. The private reveal wasn't that they were plotting against me. It was that the system assumed my compliance with the imbalance. And here's the moment that crystallized everything. I opened my own employment contract and reviewed the indemnification clauses, standard executive protections, but with one key condition. Protection applied when actions were taken in good faith within the scope of authorized strategic participation. Strategic participation, not operational execution. I had authority in name, but limited documented authorship in strategy formation, which meant if a board inquiry ever questioned structural transparency, my signature could be interpreted as operational oversight, not strategic direction. And that distinction matters. I didn't feel anger. I felt stillness. Because the leverage wasn't in exposing anyone. It was in understanding that I did not need to absorb structural asymmetry to prove loyalty. The power shift wasn't external. It was internal recognition that I had enough documentation to clarify authorship if ever required. I no longer needed to preemptively protect narratives I didn't design. My silence had been interpreted as consent. But consent can be recalibrated. I closed the spreadsheet and leaned back. For the first time since my promotion, I didn't feel like the net. I felt like the architect of my own perimeter. There's a quiet strength that comes when you realize you are not trapped. You are simply overfunctioning. And overfunctioning can stop, not dramatically, not destructively, just precisely. That weekend, I didn't work. I didn't draft mitigation plans. I didn't prepare contingency messaging. I let approved timelines stand as approved. I let disclosures remain where executives had placed them. I allowed alignment to mean what it said. And in that stillness, one truth became undeniable. If the structure wobbled without hidden stabilization, it wouldn't collapse because I exposed it. It would shift because it was imbalanced to begin with. That was the private reveal. Not that I held power over them, but I no longer needed to hold them up. Clarity is peaceful. The decision is more difficult. After the spreadsheet, after the contract review, after the quiet recalibration of my silence, I reached a point where observation was no longer enough. Because understanding imbalance doesn't protect you from it. It simply gives you options. And I had 3. Option 1, confront directly. Schedule a closed-door conversation with the CEO and Daniel. Present the structural asymmetry. Request formal adjustment of measurement metrics and disclosure positioning. It would be rational, professional, transparent. It would also immediately reposition me as adversarial. Not wrong, just inconvenient. Option 2, continue as I had. Aware, documented, cautious, but fundamentally cooperative. Protect myself through archived clarity while maintaining execution smoothing when necessary. This option was safest in the short term. It was also the one that guaranteed the pattern would continue. Option 3, redefine my participation entirely. Not by resigning, not by threatening, but by narrowing my scope to exactly what had been authorized, and nothing beyond it. No anticipatory mitigation. No narrative cushioning, no timeline compression without written strategic endorsement. If growth is projected aggressively, the projection would stand in its original form. If disclosure language was minimized, the minimization would remain visible in documentation. If operational variance surfaced, it would surface against the framework that created it. This wasn't sabotage, it was alignment. The irreversible part wasn't what I would say, it was what I would stop doing. And once you stop absorbing asymmetry, systems recalibrate quickly. I chose option 3, quietly. The following Monday, I requested a formal clarification meeting, not to accuse, but to define scope. I want to ensure my performance metrics align with strategic participation, I said calmly. Can we document where operational execution ends and strategic framing begins? Daniel seemed slightly puzzled, but not threatened. You've always had broad discretion. I'd prefer defined discretion, I replied. The CEO nodded thoughtfully. Fair. We spent 45 minutes outlining decision tiers. What is required is executive-level strategic confirmation. What constituted operational execution? What disclosures required joint sign-off? Everything was cordial. Everything was documented. What they didn't register was that I was narrowing the bridge. Previously, I had stood in the space between ambition and outcome. Now that space required visible co-authorship. The irreversible shift wasn't dramatic. It was structural. Because from that point forward, any aggressive projection required explicit executive confirmation tied to strategic intent, not implicit reliance on operational smoothing. If they wanted velocity, they would own velocity. If they wanted minimized disclosure visibility, they would acknowledge that placement. And if they chose transparency, I would support it fully. I wasn't withdrawing effort. I was redistributing accountability. That's the decision most people avoid. Not revenge, not exposure. Redistribution. It changes everything because it removes illusion. And illusion is often what keeps the imbalance comfortable. As I left the meeting, my black leather notebook felt lighter in my hand. For the first time, I wasn't preparing to absorb impact. I was preparing to witness structure in its natural form. And once you make that choice, you can't quietly go back. After the scope clarification meeting, nothing looked different. No announcement went out, no policy memo was circulated. No one whispered about tension in the executive suite, but the mechanics had shifted. And mechanics, when altered quietly, change outcomes. I began implementing what I privately called clean lines. Every major initiative now includes a short written executive summary drafted by growth leadership and confirmed by the CEO before entering operational planning. I positioned it as efficiency to streamline execution clarity. No one objected. Why would they? Clear documentation sounds responsible. But the summary included 3 precise elements: stated strategic intent, acknowledged risk factors, confirmed ownership of projection assumptions. Ownership. Previously, projection assumptions floated: optimistic, flexible, loosely attributed, and now they were anchored. If timelines were ambitious, the summary stated that ambition explicitly. If disclosures were structured for brevity, that brevity was noted as strategic framing, always professionally worded, never accusatory. Meanwhile, I adjusted something else. Operational forecasting reports were no longer pre-softened before executive review. I presented them in raw alignment with approved projections. When a milestone slipped because integration dependencies had been compressed too aggressively, I didn't reframe it as minor variance. I reported it as variance against executive-approved accelerated timeline. Language matters. It wasn't to blame. It was clarity. The first time this happened, the room grew quieter than usual. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Can we recover that variance?" "Yes," I said evenly. "If we adjust milestone pacing moving forward, then adjust it." "Understood. I'll document revised timeline ownership." Ownership. Again. No one challenged the phrasing. But I noticed something subtle in the CEO's expression. Not frustration, but recalculation. Without hidden padding, optimism began to feel heavier. At the same time, I strengthened my perimeter quietly. I reviewed our internal whistleblower and governance protocols. Not because I intended to use them, but because understanding procedural escalation frameworks matters when responsibility is shared unevenly. Everything remained ethical, everything remained legal, but alignment was now symmetrical. I also made a personal financial decision. For the first time since joining the company, I diversified my professional identity externally. I accepted a speaking engagement invitation at a corporate governance panel, something I had previously declined to avoid appearing distracted. Visibility outside the internal structure recalibrates internal perception, not aggressively, subtly. Within weeks, I sensed the difference. Growth proposals began arriving with more tempered projections. Disclosure placement discussions occurred earlier, not after draft finalization. Legal was looped in sooner. It wasn't that they feared exposure. It was that insulation was no longer automatic, and systems adapt when safety nets retract. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by my office again. "You've tightened document." Mitatin, he said. "Yes," I replied calmly. "Clarity protects everyone." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "I suppose it does." There was no confrontation, no accusation, just recognition. What they never fully understood was that my silence had not been compliance. It had been repositioned. Because moving in silence doesn't mean standing still. It means shifting weight without drawing attention. And when the structure finally bears its own load, the consequences feel organic, not engineered. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They accumulate. The first one was small, a quarterly board review, where projected integration milestones were compared. This time, to the exact executive summaries Daniel had confirmed months earlier. No smoothing, no reframing, just alignment. One acquisition was 2 weeks behind its accelerated timeline. Not catastrophic, but visible. The board chair flipped through the slide deck slowly. "These timelines were intentionally compressed?" he asked. Daniel answered confidently, "Yes, for early momentum." The chair nodded. "And operational capacity was aligned with that compression?" All eyes turned subtly to me. In the past, I might have absorbed the tension with reassuring language. Instead, I responded calmly. Operational execution followed the approved accelerated framework. Variance reflects the pace originally selected. Not defensive, not accusatory. Accurate. The room didn't react dramatically, but something intangible shifted. For the first time, the weight of acceleration didn't dissolve into operational resilience. It sat where it had been authored. After the meeting, Daniel was quieter than usual. Not hostile, reflective. That was the first ripple. The second consequence appeared in performance reviews. Historically, growth leadership bonuses were benchmarked against headline expansion metrics. Operations evaluations, including mine, were benchmarked against execution variance. But now, because projections were clearly attributed and timeline pacing documented, compensation committees began asking more detailed questions. Should accelerated milestones adjust variance expectations? One HR executive asked during calibration. It was a procedural question, but procedural questions reshape incentives. Without hidden stabilization, ambitious framing began to carry measurable weight. Another ripple. Internally, I noticed growth proposals becoming more measured. Phrases like guaranteed acceleration shifted to targeted acceleration. Disclosure sections were no longer quietly relocated to appendices without discussion. Legal requested earlier involvement. It wasn't fear, it was recalibration. And then came the moment I knew the structure felt the shift. During an executive planning session, Daniel presented a new acquisition concept: aggressive market entry, high projected returns. Midway through his presentation, he paused. We'll need to ensure integration pacing is realistic, he added, almost as an afterthought. Scarlett, let's align early. Let's align early. Not, you'll handle it. Not, operations will buffer. Align. Shared space. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The consequences weren't explosive. No scandal erupted. No emergency board session convened. Instead, optimism lost its cushion. And when optimism carries its own weight, behavior adjusts. What surprised me most wasn't their reaction. It was my own calm. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt balanced. Because for the first time, responsibility and authorship were beginning to mirror each other. The structure wasn't collapsing. It was stabilizing, without me standing underneath it alone. And that is the quietest form of dominance, not forcing change. Allowing truth to remain visible long enough that adjustment becomes necessary. By the time they fully recognized the shift, it wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. 2 quarters after I narrowed the bridge between ambition and execution, the company entered its annual strategic review cycle. Historically, these reviews were celebratory, highlighting expansion, velocity, and forward momentum. This year felt different, not tense, precise. The board had begun requesting comparative overlays, projected timelines versus actual integration pacing, disclosure placement summaries, and strategic intent statements attached to each acquisition. Documentation I had implemented quietly. During the closed-door pre-review session, Daniel approached me with a softer tone than usual. We may need to contextualize some of the acceleration decisions, he said. Context is in the executive summaries, I replied calmly. He hesitated. Yes, but framing matters. Framing. That word used to live exclusively in growth presentations. Now it had circled back. I agree, I said. That's why authorship was documented. There was no anger in the room, no raised voices. But for the first time, the comfort of blurred ownership was gone. Because once accountability is written clearly enough, you can't unwrite it without drawing attention. And attention was the one thing they preferred to avoid. At the formal board session, questions were sharper, not accusatory. Curious. Why was disclosure visibility reduced in this case? What drove the timeline compression decision here? How did risk acknowledgement evolve between draft versions? Each question was answerable. Each answer required strategic authorship acknowledgement. No one blamed me. They couldn't. The documentation reflected alignment exactly as approved. But something else became clear. Had this recalibration occurred earlier, had authorship and responsibility been aligned from the beginning, the narrative could have evolved gradually. Now the adjustment felt reactive, which is always harder to manage. After the session, the CEO asked to speak with me privately. He didn't accuse me of anything. He didn't praise me either. He studied me with a level of awareness that hadn't been there before. You've changed how operations engage, he said. I've clarified how operations engage, I replied. A long pause. We relied on you heavily, he admitted. I know. Another pause. And we assumed elasticity. Elasticity. It was the closest anyone had come to naming it. I didn't respond immediately. Then I said, elasticity works best when tension is balanced. He nodded slowly. The part that made it too late wasn't conflict. It was precedent. Because once the board becomes accustomed to documented authorship clarity, reverting to blurred accountability becomes visibly intentional. And no one wants visible intentional opacity. Within weeks, compensation frameworks were quietly revised. Performance metrics between growth and operations were recalibrated to reflect shared acceleration risk. Not publicly announced, just adjusted. But relationships had shifted. Trust hadn't broken. It had matured. The CEO no longer looked at me as an outsider. He looked at me as a counterweight. Daniel became more deliberate in language, less casual in projection framing. No one confronted me, but everyone adjusted. And once a system adapts to symmetry, it cannot comfortably return to asymmetry. That was the irreversible part. Not punishment, correction. Quiet, permanent, structural. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation. It felt like acknowledgement. It happened late one evening after most of the executive floor had cleared out. Chicago's skyline reflected against the glass walls, the city quiet but awake. I was finishing notes from a governance alignment meeting when Daniel knocked lightly on my open door. "Do you have a minute?" Of course. He stepped in, not with his usual relaxed confidence, but with something more measured. "I've been thinking about the past year," he began, "about how we structured decisions." I closed my notebook but didn't interrupt. He leaned back against the chair across from me. "You let us carry our own projections." It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. "Yes," I said calmly. "Before, you would adjust things quietly." "I adjusted execution," I replied, "not authorship." A faint, almost rueful smile crossed his face. "I didn't realize how much weight you were absorbing." I did. There was no edge in my voice, just clarity. He exhaled slowly. "It wasn't intentional." "I know. And I meant it. This wasn't a story about villains. It was about convenience, about systems that reward optimism and rely on stability without questioning who provides it." Daniel looked at me more directly. "Why didn't you bring it up sooner?" I considered that. "Because I needed to understand it fully first," I said. "And because if I had raised it emotionally, it would have become personal." He nodded. That part he understood. "And now?" he asked. "Now it's structural," I replied, "not personal." A long silence followed, not uncomfortable but reflective. "You've shifted the balance," he said finally. "No," I corrected gently. I stopped holding it alone. That was the truth. I hadn't dismantled anything. I hadn't exposed anyone. I hadn't escalated beyond protocol. I had simply removed the hidden elasticity. Daniel studied me as if recalibrating his perception. "I underestimated you," he admitted. "Most people underestimate silence," I said softly. There was no triumph in that sentence, no sharpness, just a fact. He stood after a moment. "We're better for it," he said. "I agree." And we were, because the organization had not fractured. It had matured. The confrontation lacked heat because it lacked hostility. There was no shouting, no humiliation, no dramatic unveiling. Just two executives acknowledging that a system had leaned too heavily in one direction and had been corrected. As he left my office, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not victory, respect. Not the kind given for absorbing impact quietly, but the kind earned for setting boundaries without noise. And in that quiet Chicago evening, watching the city lights reflect across glass and steel, I understood something deeply. Dominance does not require volume. It requires alignment. I still work in the same building. Same glass walls, same skyline, same boardroom table where optimism once floated lighter than consequence. But I no longer sit in the middle, not physically, structurally. Who I am now isn't louder. I haven't transformed into a confrontational executive. I don't dominate meetings or interrupt projections with sharp corrections. What changed is internal. I no longer equate indispensability with value. For years, I believed the highest form of contribution was absorption, taking pressure so others could perform boldly. I thought that was a strength. Now I understand something more nuanced. Strength isn't measured by how much you can carry. It's measured by what you refuse to carry alone. The organization adjusted. Performance metrics are aligned. Strategic intent is documented before execution begins. Disclosure placement is discussed openly. Legal is looped in early. Not because I demanded it loudly, because I required symmetry quietly. There's a different kind of presence that comes from that. When I speak now, it isn't to buffer ambition. It's to define architecture. When projections are proposed, I ask, where does authorship sit? When timelines are accelerated, I ask, Who holds pacing authority? The questions aren't defensive. They're structural. And here's the unexpected part. People listen more carefully, not because I became intimidating, but because my silence is no longer assumed. It's deliberate. My reputation shifted too. I'm no longer described as safe. I'm described as precise. There's a difference. Safe absorbs. Precise clarification. I mentor younger managers differently now, especially the ones who remind me of myself. Capable, reliable, praised for being steady. I tell them something I had to learn slowly. If you're always the one fixing the imbalance, eventually the imbalance will depend on you. They look surprised when I say that, because it sounds counterintuitive, but it's true. The most dangerous compliment in any professional environment is, "We can count on you to handle it." Count on you to handle what? And under whose authorship? I still carry my black leather notebook into meetings. But the sentence I wrote that Tuesday evening, "Authority without authorship is exposure," is no longer a warning to myself. It's a principle I operate by. There's no bitterness in me, no lingering resentment, just clarity. Because the day I realized my promotion was just a setup to take the fall wasn't the day I lost power. It was the day I understood where my power actually lived, not in absorbing impact, but in defining boundaries. And boundaries, when set calmly, don't fracture structures. They strengthen them. If you've stayed with me this long, you might have expected a dramatic ending, a resignation, a public exposure, a moment where someone gets what they deserve. But real power rarely looks like spectacle. The day I realized my promotion was just a setup to take the fall wasn't the day I walked away. It was the day I stopped carrying what wasn't mine. That's the lesson, not revenge, not victory. Alignment. In professional spaces, and honestly in life, there are people who are praised for being dependable, steady, low maintenance, the ones who just handle things. And there's honor in that. But there's danger too. Because if you consistently absorb the consequences of decisions you didn't author, the system quietly adapts around your elasticity until your strength becomes someone else's insurance policy. The title I was given came with authority in name, liability in reality. What changed everything wasn't confrontation. It was documentation. It was precision. It was refusing to blur authorship. Once responsibility and authorship became visible in the same place, behavior adjusted naturally. No humiliation required, no destruction necessary, just clarity. And clarity has weight. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. You don't need to shout to redefine your role. You don't need to burn bridges to restore balance. You only need to stop cushioning the imbalance quietly. Because once you remove the hidden padding, structures reveal themselves. And most of the time, they don't collapse. They correct. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever realized that something you were praised for was slowly positioning you to absorb consequences no one else wanted to hold? If so, what did you do? I'd really like to know.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.